March 8, 2014. A Boeing 777 carrying 239 people takes off from Kuala Lumpur, bound for Beijing. 40 minutes later, it vanishes from radar. No distress call, no wreckage, no warning. For the next 7 years, it would become the most expensive search in aviation history, covering an area larger than the continental United States, and it would end with barely any answers at all. This is the story of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. And more than a decade later, we still don't fully know what happened. It started as a routine red-eye MH370 pushed back from Kuala Lumpur International Airport just after midnight, local time. On board were 227 passengers from 14 different countries and 12 crew members. At the controls, Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, a 53-year-old veteran with over 18,000 flying hours, and First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid, 27, who was still completing his training on the 777. The aircraft climbed to cruising altitude without incident. At 1:19 a.m., air traffic control in Kuala Lumpur handed the flight off to Vietnamese airspace and told the crew to contact Ho Chi Minh Control. The last words heard from the cockpit came back over the radio, calm and routine. Seconds later, the plane's transponder, the device that broadcasts identity and altitude to radar, went silent. It never checked in with Vietnam. What happened next would only be pieced together weeks later, using military radar data that Malaysia was initially reluctant to share. Instead of continuing northeast toward Beijing, the aircraft turned sharply west, crossing back over the Malay Peninsula, before turning northwest over the Andaman Sea. Someone, or something, had taken Flight 370 hundreds of miles from where it was supposed to be. And whoever was flying it did not want to be seen doing it. When the plane failed to arrive in Beijing, confusion turned to alarm. Malaysia Airlines initially believed the aircraft was still in Vietnamese airspace. Vietnam said it had never entered their airspace at all. For hours, nobody could agree on where the plane had gone, or even where to start looking. The first search efforts focused on the South China Sea, along the planned flight path. Ships and aircraft from a dozen countries combed the water for days. They found nothing, because the plane was never there. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, Inmarsat, a British satellite communications company. Even though MH370's transponder and communication systems had gone dark, the aircraft's satellite terminal continued to send automatic, content-less signals, sometimes called handshakes, to an Inmarsat satellite once an hour, for over 6 hours after the plane disappeared from radar. Using a technique that measured the tiny frequency shift in these handshakes, similar to how a car horn's pitch changes as it passes you, engineers were able to calculate arcs showing where the aircraft could have been at each ping. That analysis pointed to one shocking conclusion. Flight 370 hadn't crashed near Malaysia at all. It had kept flying for nearly 7 more hours, ending somewhere in the remote southern Indian Ocean, thousands of miles from land. This triggered what became the largest search in aviation history. Australia took the lead, coordinating ships, aircraft, and eventually deep-sea sonar equipment scanning the ocean floor across an area of more than 46,000 square miles, some of the most remote, deepest water on Earth. Search crews spent years mapping terrain no human had ever charted, and still, for a long time, they found nothing. Then, in July 2015, nearly a year and a half after the disappearance, a piece of aircraft wreckage washed ashore on Réunion Island, a French territory in the Indian Ocean, over 2,000 miles from the search zone. It was a flaperon, part of the wing, and investigators confirmed it belonged to MH370. It was the first physical proof that the plane had indeed gone down in the Indian Ocean. Over the following 2 years, more than 24 additional debris fragments turned up on beaches across Africa and Indian Ocean islands, Mozambique, South Africa, Mauritius, Tanzania. Ocean drift modelers use these findings to work backward, refining estimates of where the plane might have entered the water. But debris confirms an ending. It doesn't explain what happened, or exactly where the main wreckage rests. Despite the discoveries, and despite a search area that stretched across the ocean floor for years, the main body of the aircraft was never located. In January 2017, The official underwater search was suspended. A private company, Ocean Infinity, resumed the hunt in 2018 under a no-find, no-fee arrangement, scanning new areas with advanced autonomous submarines. That search also ended without success. To this day, the fuselage of MH370 has never been found. With no wreckage, no black box, and no clear motive, the investigation left a vacuum, and theories rushed in to fill it. Let's walk through the major ones, and what the evidence actually supports. The flight's sharp turn away from its route, the disabling of communication systems, and the fact that the plane apparently flew on for hours under some form of control all pointed investigators toward deliberate human action. Malaysian investigators examined Captain Zahari's flight simulator, recovered from his home, and found that deleted data showed a flight path into the southern Indian Ocean with similarities to MH370's apparent final course. Investigators were careful to note this didn't prove intent to crash the actual aircraft. Simulator data doesn't equal a suicide note, but it fueled enormous speculation about the captain's state of mind. No conclusive motive, note, or communication was ever found. Some experts proposed a catastrophic fire or depressurization event that incapacitated the crew, leaving the plane to fly on autopilot until it ran out of fuel. The problem with this theory is the turns. An unconscious crew wouldn't typically execute the kind of deliberate course changes radar data showed. For this theory to hold, the failure would have needed to strike after the diversion was already programmed in, a narrow and hard-to-prove window. Early on, hijacking was a leading hypothesis, especially given 2 passengers were found to be traveling on stolen passports. Investigators looked closely at both men and ultimately found no connection to terrorism or any credible motive. They were asylum seekers using false documents, unrelated to the disappearance. No hijacking claim was ever made by any group, which remains one of the strangest aspects of the case. Hijackings are almost always followed by demands or claims of responsibility. Investigators confirmed the plane was carrying a shipment of lithium-ion batteries, a cargo known to pose fire risk in other incidents. But like the mechanical failure theory, this doesn't easily explain the controlled turns before the plane's systems went dark. In 2018, Malaysia released its final safety investigation report. It was remarkably blunt for an official government document, stating investigators were unable to determine the real cause of the disappearance, and explicitly said they could not rule out third-party intervention. In other words, after 4 years, hundreds of millions of dollars, and the largest search in aviation history, the official conclusion was that they still didn't know. Independent investigators have continued to push their own theories in the years since, with some pointing back toward deliberate pilot action as the explanation that best fits the available radar and satellite data, while others continue to argue for an unexplained mechanical cascade. No consensus exists. What everyone agrees on is this: the data trail, built almost entirely from satellite handshake pings and drifting debris, tells us roughly where the plane ended up, but not who, or what, put it there. The search for MH370 has never fully closed. Families of the passengers have spent years pushing governments to resume the hunt, arguing that new drift analysis and refined satellite data point to more promising search zones than the ones already scanned. Ocean Infinity, the private search firm, has continued discussions with Malaysia's government about renewed search efforts using updated data and more advanced underwater drone technology, operating again under a no-find no-fee model. For the families of the 239 people on board, the absence of wreckage means an absence of closure, no confirmed remains, no final resting place, and in many cases, no ability to legally settle affairs tied to a confirmed death. The case fundamentally changed aviation safety policy. In its wake, international regulators moved to require more frequent aircraft position reporting, and airlines adopted new tracking standards specifically so that a modern jetliner could never again vanish from monitoring for hours at a time. In that narrow sense, MH370 already changed how commercial aviation works, even without ever fully explaining its own ending. Somewhere in the southern Indian Ocean, under thousands of feet of water, in some of the most remote terrain on the planet, the wreckage of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 is very likely still sitting on the ocean floor, waiting to be found. Until it is, the disappearance of MH370 remains one of the few great mysteries left in modern travel. A reminder that even in an age of GPS, satellites, and constant connectivity, it's still possible for 239 people to vanish, almost without a trace. If you learned something new today, let me know in the comments. and subscribe for more deep dives into history's unsolved mysteries.